For a quarter of a century, this financial operation unfolded in plain sight, yet remained invisible to most Americans. Today, newly uncovered research exposes how the Chinese government systematically positioned itself within the heart of the United States economy, channeling massive sums into American businesses without triggering public alarm or regulatory intervention. We're talking about over $200 billion in strategic financing that flowed quietly, deliberately, and with precision into sectors that form the backbone of American economic power. These financial movements weren't arbitrary. They represented a carefully orchestrated strategy that allowed Beijing to weave itself into the fabric of America's industrial landscape, reaching even into companies with connections to the CIA, the FBI, and other sensitive government agencies. While Western observers believed China was simply responding to market opportunities and global trends, evidence now suggests something far more calculated was taking place. From energy infrastructure to advanced manufacturing to cutting-edge robotics, critical American industries were developing deep financial relationships with Beijing. Relationships that existed long before American policymakers recognized their strategic implications. This isn't just sophisticated financial planning. This is leverage, the kind that can be deployed at critical moments. And in an era defined by geopolitical uncertainty and economic fragility, leverage transforms into one of the most potent and dangerous forms of influence a nation can wield. Before we examine the mechanics of how these financial arrangements operated, which American sectors were targeted, and why this could fundamentally alter America's economic trajectory in ways that transcend any single election or policy shift, make sure you're subscribed. What we're about to uncover challenges the basic assumptions many hold about American economic independence. Let's begin. The silent infiltration tracing. 2 decades of strategic finance. Groundbreaking research has revealed that enormous quantities of capital quietly migrated from Chinese state-controlled financial institutions into American corporations and infrastructure projects spanning the past 25 years. This comprehensive new dataset meticulously tracks official Chinese lending activities from the year 2000 through 2023. What emerges from this analysis is stunning. More than $200 billion entered the United States, not concentrated in a single industry, but dispersed across nearly 2,500 distinct projects, touching virtually every American state. We're talking about natural gas pipeline networks, major airport terminal facilities, data storage centers, logistics distribution hubs, and countless other critical installations that form the invisible infrastructure Americans depend on daily. But here's what elevates this from a financial curiosity to a genuine security concern. A substantial portion of this lending activity occurred after 2018, precisely when tensions between Washington and Beijing were intensifying dramatically, when global financial markets were experiencing unprecedented volatility, and when the rhetoric around economic decoupling was reaching fever pitch. This isn't ancient history we're discussing. These financial arrangements were being established in real time during election cycles, throughout escalating tariff disputes, and while the American economy was navigating extraordinary pressures and uncertainties. Consider one particularly troubling case: Iron Shore, an American insurance firm. In 2015, Chinese state-owned banking institutions facilitated financing that enabled a Chinese company to raise $1.2 billion for acquiring an 80% controlling stake in this business. What made this transaction especially problematic wasn't just the scale, it was what investigators discovered about Iron Shore's client portfolio. Buried within the company's customer base were individuals and entities connected to some of America's most sensitive government agencies, including personnel affiliated with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. American regulators initially failed to recognize the national security implications because the transaction had been deliberately structured through shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, a jurisdiction famous for financial opacity. Only after the true nature of the deal finally surfaced did the United States government force a divestiture. Another revealing case emerged in 2016 when the Export-Import Bank of China, a policy bank directly controlled by the Chinese government, extended $150 million in financing to assist a Chinese corporation in acquiring an American robotics equipment manufacturer based in Michigan. The timing here wasn't coincidental. China had recently unveiled its Made in China 2025 strategic initiative, an ambitious industrial policy explicitly prioritizing media, Chinese flag over industrial factory, workers assembling robots, Made in China 2025 document on table, biotechnology lab in China robotics, semiconductor technology, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing capabilities. The strategic intent becomes transparent when you connect these dots. Beijing wasn't pursuing these investments for short-term financial returns. The objective was securing strategic positions within America's technological foundation, the industries that will define economic and military power for decades to come. The system failed. When American defenses couldn't respond, this is where the narrative becomes even more disturbing. American institutions recognized that China was executing an aggressive strategic plan, and yet proved unable to effectively counter it. The most revealing example involves Alphatec, a California-based chip design company whose software powers smartphones, autonomous vehicle systems, and potentially advanced military weapons platforms. A United States government assessment had already designated this category of technology as critical for national defense purposes. The warning was public knowledge, documented in official reports. But when the moment arrived to act on that assessment, America's defensive mechanisms collapsed. In early 2023, a company calling itself Avatar Integrated Systems appeared in a Delaware bankruptcy proceeding, quietly attempting to purchase Alphatec. On the surface, the transaction appeared unremarkable, just another corporate acquisition being processed through bankruptcy court. But underneath that benign exterior lay precisely the profile that U.S. security officials had been warning about for years. Avatar's chairman was a Chinese steel industrialist, and his Hong Kong-based investment firm controlled substantial equity in the proposed deal. Exactly the type of investor who could be advancing Beijing's strategic objectives. That fact pattern alone should have immediately triggered a mandatory national security review. It didn't happen. The acquisition proceeded without any examination by CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Despite the fact that CFIUS exists specifically to prevent foreign entities from acquiring sensitive American technology. A 6-month congressional investigation later exposed the systemic failures. CFIUS rarely monitors the new pathways Chinese purchasers are exploiting, including bankruptcy court proceedings and foreign venture capital funding channeled into American startup companies. Even more concerning, CFIUS doesn't operate proactively. It functions on a reactive basis. Unless a government agency specifically raises concerns about a particular transaction, the deal simply proceeds without scrutiny. Recent reporting indicates that at least 13 major American companies are already under Chinese ownership or control, transactions that occurred without meaningful oversight. This is what makes the current situation genuinely dangerous. America isn't confronting the traditional model of foreign acquisition, factories and physical assets changing hands. These are digital acquisitions, software code, proprietary algorithms, data architectures, assets where influence can be embedded invisibly and becomes extraordinarily difficult to detect or reverse. The nature of economic competition has evolved fundamentally, but America's defensive infrastructure has not kept pace. By the time Washington identifies the threat, the technology has already transferred to foreign control. If a case as straightforward as Alphatec, with clear warning signs and documented national security implications, slipped through unnoticed, how many similar transactions are occurring at this very moment? How many have already been completed without anyone recognizing the strategic transfer that took place? This is precisely why Washington is now issuing urgent warnings to American companies to avoid Chinese financing arrangements. But the warnings come after years of unmonitored transfers have already occurred. The deception of legitimacy. How normal business masked strategic intent. Washington believed it was monitoring the front entrance. But China had already entered through the service door. This isn't just a collection of isolated business transactions. It actually represents a systematic pattern. The deployment of shell company structures in jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and Delaware successfully obscured the true source of financing. These elaborate financial architectures enabled state-backed Chinese banks to establish deep positions within critical American industries, all while keeping their involvement concealed from public view. Among all these corporations, analysts have identified 10 that face severe overexposure to China, meaning their business models simply can't sustain themselves without Chinese market access. This reality makes the situation particularly alarming from the United States government's perspective. A newly released vulnerability index, compiled by Strategy Risks, a business intelligence consultancy, reveals that many of America's most recognizable corporate brands rank among the top 10 companies with dangerous levels of China exposure. These aren't peripheral players. The list includes Apple, Disney, Tesla, and Coca-Cola. Names that honestly define American culture, technology innovation, entertainment, transportation, and consumer lifestyle. When corporations operating at this magnitude become heavily dependent on a single foreign nation, the risks extend far beyond quarterly earnings volatility. The concern here really transcends market fluctuations. We're talking about strategic dependence. Many of these corporations rely fundamentally on China for manufacturing capacity, supply chain networks, rare earth minerals, consumer market demand, and distribution infrastructure. Some even require Chinese regulatory permission just to conduct business operations within the country at all. That means their corporate futures can be shaped by policy decisions made entirely outside American jurisdiction. With global tensions escalating, the economic vulnerability these companies face is no longer hypothetical. It's concrete, and it could intensify rapidly. If America's largest corporations are structurally bound to China, what happens when political friction transforms into economic policy action? The answer remains uncertain, but the dependency has already been built into the foundation. And honestly, the more deeply analysts examine this web of relationships, the more vulnerable the entire system appears. What should concern you, and everyone watching this, isn't merely the dollar amount involved. It's that China has constructed an extensive influence network utilizing finance as the mechanism to gain leverage over America's future-defining industries. These aren't passive investors seeking portfolio diversification. These are lending institutions connected to the Chinese state, making calculated strategic placements. If you believe this is simply capitalism at work, reconsider. When you combine strategic lending, opaque ownership structures, and access to critical technology, you get something fundamentally different. A situation where finance transforms into an instrument of power and potentially becomes a source of long-term leverage over American economic sovereignty. Hiding in plain sight, when routine deals concealed strategic operations. At first examination, loans supporting airport terminal construction or data center development appeared entirely conventional. Industry professionals treated them as standard infrastructure financing, and journalists covering these transactions described many as ordinary commercial arrangements. For years, that narrative went unchallenged. But the AData investigation shattered that comfortable interpretation. Their research team assembled tens of thousands of public records, connecting data points that had never been analyzed together in any single comprehensive review. Once those fragments were assembled into a complete picture, a disturbing pattern materialized, a pattern that had remained invisible until that moment. Chinese state-linked banking institutions were providing the capital. Offshore shell company structures were masking the true ownership, and those financial frameworks quietly enabled foreign purchasers to acquire control of American firms. Examined individually, each transaction appeared innocuous. Analyzed collectively, they revealed something entirely different. A slow, decades-long influence operation unfolding beneath the surface of normal business activity. Experts who have reviewed these findings say the pattern cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The transactions cluster around sectors crucial to both national security and economic competitiveness. And when a state-backed lender finances a buyer who then acquires a company possessing specialized technology or strategic capabilities that transcends simple lending, it becomes leverage, a silent mechanism that establishes connections, creates dependencies, and generates strategic options that can be exercised at future critical moments. Officials who examine these capital flows acknowledge they were stunned by how quietly the entire operation proceeded. There were no dramatic public announcements, no major media coverage, just steady, concealed movement of capital, gradually reshaping the structure of American industry. And the recent trade confrontation exposed the most uncomfortable reality. Leading American corporations depend on the Chinese market far more profoundly than anyone had acknowledged. In certain industries, access to Chinese consumers represents the difference between growth and contraction. That dependence means even the most seemingly routine financial arrangement can carry consequences that extend far beyond what appears in the paperwork. The hidden power in financial contracts, how leverage gets built. When capital is lent, the actual power resides in the contractual terms behind the transaction. Many financing agreements include provisions allowing lenders to convert debt into equity ownership or to seize assets if payment schedules aren't maintained. During periods of stability, these contractual clauses remain dormant and invisible. During a crisis, they transform into leverage with real consequences. If diplomatic relations with China deteriorate, a loan agreement signed years earlier can suddenly impact control over a critical supplier, a proprietary technology, or an entire corporate entity. A lender can enforce its contractual rights. A dependent American firm can find itself thrown into operational uncertainty without warning. This is why analysts increasingly warn that financial exposure can evolve into strategic pressure without requiring any military action whatsoever. In the contemporary environment, contracts and capital flows perform the role that naval blockades and troop deployments once did. And the influence extends beyond simple ownership stakes. Financing arrangements can grant lenders subtle influence over board-level decisions, voting authority, or access to sensitive corporate information during due diligence processes. Ownership structures can create legal pathways to proprietary data, customer databases, or specialized manufacturing processes, all extremely valuable when the lender maintains connections to a foreign government pursuing long-term strategic objectives. Consider a hypothetical American semiconductor supplier that accepted Chinese financing. A single missed payment could activate a contractual provision granting the lender an equity position in the company. No hostile takeover, no headline-generating controversy, just a contract provision quietly shifting control according to predetermined legal terms. These channels, contractual rights embedded in loan agreements, data access granted during investment negotiations, hidden influence exercised through opaque ownership structures, create options, and those options shape corporate decisions long before executives and board members recognize how much strategic autonomy they've surrendered. The Great Reversal. American companies retreat from China. China invested years building quiet leverage within the American economy. But now, for the first time in decades, American corporations are pulling back, visibly and dramatically. And the velocity of this retreat reveals just how unstable the bilateral relationship has become. According to data from the U.S.-China Business Council, only 48% of American firms plan to invest in China during 2025. Just 12 months ago, that figure stood at 80%. A collapse this precipitous doesn't reflect normal market adjustment. It's a warning signal. One primary driver is the relentless tariff pressure. Corporate executives report that rising costs and unpredictable trade policy shifts have made operating in China substantially more challenging. Add geopolitical tensions, escalating national security concerns, and tightening export control restrictions, and long-term strategic planning becomes nearly impossible. But the challenge isn't solely coming from Washington. Inside China itself, economic growth is decelerating. Consumer demand is weakening. Industrial overcapacity is mounting. Corporate profit margins are compressing. And competition from Chinese companies, particularly in artificial intelligence and advanced technology sectors, has become fierce. Even America's largest multinational corporations struggle to maintain competitive positions. As a consequence, nearly half of American companies surveyed by the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai report they have already redirected planned capital investments away from China, reallocating towards Southeast Asian nations and India. This isn't a minor tactical adjustment. It represents a fundamental strategic reorientation, and it's accelerating. The underlying problem is uncertainty itself. Policy volatility, regulatory crackdowns targeting specific sectors, and political risks now define the operational environment. What once appeared to be the world's most reliable economic growth engine now resembles a hazardous landscape where the rules can change without warning. Yet American companies aren't abandoning China entirely. Many still view the Chinese market as essential to their global competitive positioning. But they no longer trust the stability underlying that opportunity. They're hedging their exposure, diversifying their geographic footprint, preparing contingency plans for potential shocks. What used to represent a fortress of guaranteed growth has become a high-stakes gamble, and nobody can predict how long the current arrangements will remain viable. The leverage yet to be used. What comes next? So here's the fundamental question that should concern every American. If American companies are withdrawing this dramatically from China right now, during a period of relative peace, what happens when the next genuine crisis erupts and China decides to activate the strategic leverage it spent 25 years methodically constructing? The financial connections have been established. The contractual mechanisms are in place. The dependencies have been built into corporate structures that now form essential parts of the American economy. We've seen how Beijing positioned itself within critical technology companies, infrastructure networks, and even businesses serving America's intelligence community. We've documented how American defensive mechanisms failed to detect or prevent these strategic acquisitions. We've identified major American corporations whose business models now depend fundamentally on Chinese market access and Chinese supply chains. All of this creates a vulnerability that didn't exist a generation ago, a vulnerability that transforms financial relationships into potential pressure points that can be exploited during times of tension. The tools of modern geopolitical competition no longer require armies or sanctions alone. Financial leverage, supply chain dependencies, and technology access can be weaponized in ways that are less visible but potentially just as effective. China studied how economic interdependence functions in the modern world and built positions accordingly. The question now is whether America can recognize the strategic implications of what's been constructed and whether it's possible to reduce these vulnerabilities before they're tested in a genuine crisis. Because one thing has become abundantly clear: the economic relationship between the United States and China is far more complex, far more intertwined, and far more consequential than most Americans realize. And the leverage built through decades of patient financial maneuvering doesn't disappear simply because the political climate changes. It sits there, embedded in contracts and corporate structures, waiting for the moment when it might be used. The real test isn't whether this leverage exists. The evidence makes that undeniable. The real test is what happens the day someone decides to use it. What do you think happens next? Share your perspective in the comments below. And if you want to stay informed as this story continues to develop, make sure you're subscribed. We'll see you in the next investigation.